Hey guys, tonight we are going to do something a little different, a little quieter. We're going to dive into the surprisingly dramatic, slow minus burn evolution of the humble button. It sounds mundane, I know. It's the thing you obsessively fiddle with on your shirt, the thing that pops off at the most inconvenient time. But the simple act of fastening two pieces of cloth together has a history so long and so unexpectedly contentious. It deserves its own quiet moment in the spotlight. Imagine, for a second, a world without them. It's not just a fashion inconvenience. It's a world where staying warm and, frankly, keeping your clothes on is a daily engineering challenge. You'd probably find yourself in a rather drafty situation pretty quickly. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's a small click for you, but it makes a huge difference for this little corner of the internet. And while you're at it, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your city and the current time in the comments below. It's always a quiet thrill to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture yourself standing in a misty field, somewhere in ancient Europe. The air is cold and damp, clinging to your skin. You're wrapped in a heavy cloak made of rough minus spun wool. It's your primary defense against the biting wind, your portable shelter. But you have a problem. How do you keep this giant, heavy blanket wrapped around you while you walk, or work, or ride a horse? You don't have buttons. They don't exist yet, at least not in any way we would recognize. So what are your options? Your most likely go minus to solution is a pin. You reach into a small leather pouch at your waist and pull out a long, sharpened piece of bone. Maybe it's bronze, if you're redoing well for yourself. You gather the two edges of your cloak at your shoulder, bunching the thick fabric together, and very carefully push the pin through the layers. It's effective, for the most part. But it's also a little precarious. A sudden movement, a snag on a tree branch, and the pin could come loose, leaving your cloak to flap open in the wind. Or worse, you could jab yourself. It's a constant, low minus level risk you just live with. If you were, say, a Roman citizen a few centuries earlier, you'd have a more sophisticated version of this, the fibula. Think of it as the ancient world safety pin, but far more elegant. You might have one of bronze, fashioned into the shape of an eagle or a horse. It has a spring mechanism and a catch to protect the sharp point, making it far more secure than a simple straight pin. For you, this fibula isn't just a tool, it's a statement. Its size, material, and intricacy tell a story about your wealth, your family, perhaps even your military rank. A simple soldier might have a plain, functional fibula, while a wealthy senator's toga is held by one of gold, perhaps inlaid with garnets or glass. It's the Rolex of the ancient world, holding your outfit together while broadcasting your status. But even this superior technology has its limits. It works best with the drape-wide, flowing garments of the time, like the toga or the Greek chiton. It's not great for anything that needs to be fitted snugly to the body. And here's a little detail that historians still debate: the precise social language of these fibulae. Was a particular design a secret sign for a member of a specific legion, a marker of a veteran? Or was it just the fashionable new design from the capital that season, the ancient equivalent of a trending brand? We have theories, but no definitive answers. Let's step away from the world of metal for a moment. What if you're a simple farmer, with no access to fancy bronze pins? You improvise. You might use a particularly sharp and sturdy thorn, snapped from a hawthorn bush. It's a disposable, organic tool, a tiny piece of nature repurposed to serve a basic human need. Or perhaps your tunic has a series of small, hand-stitched holes along the neckline. You would then thread a leather cord or a piece of twine through them, lacing yourself in every morning. It's secure, yes, but it's a slow, deliberate process. There's no quickly throwing on a jacket. Getting dressed is a ritual. You pull the cord taut, tying it off with a knot, feeling the fabric snug against your chest. It's a method that offers a different kind of security, a feeling of being properly bound and protected, sealed into your clothes for the day. Everything you use, the pin, the fibula, the lace, is a solution to a fundamental problem, but none of them are perfect. They poke, they are expensive, they are slow, or they create permanent holes in the fabric. The world is getting by, but it's waiting for something better, something that can be both secure and easy to use, functional and decorative. It's waiting for a system that doesn't just pin fabric together, but truly joins it. The stage is set for a small, revolutionary idea, but it will take centuries to arrive. For now, you just have to be careful not to lose your pin. You let go of that thought, of the damp chill of Europe and its practical, pokey pins. The scene dissolves. The mist gives way to a hazy, sun-baked sky. The feeling of damp wool is replaced by the light touch of thin cotton on your skin. You're now standing on a wide, dusty street in a city unlike any you've ever seen. This is Mohenjo-Daro, or a similar metropolis in the Indus Valley, around 4,000 years ago. The air is warm and smells of fired brick, cattle, and something spicy you can't quite name. The city is astonishingly organized. A grid of straight streets and multi-story houses built from uniform, mud-colored bricks. It's a testament to a civilization that values order and precision. You watch the people passing by. A merchant, his face weathered by the sun, strides past, his cotton robe catching the slight breeze, and on his garment, you see them, smooth, flat discs, so neatly in a row down the front of his clothing. They are perfectly circular, carved from a milky white seashell that catches the light. Each one has 2 or 3 small holes drilled through the center, through which thread is looped to attach it to the fabric. Your first thought is a button, finally, but then you look closer. There are no corresponding holes in the other side of his robe, no slits, no loops. The robe simply overlaps, held in place by a sash tied at his waist. These little discs aren't holding anything together. They're just there, so non-flat. They are purely for show, a series of gleaming, decorative spots on an otherwise plain garment. You've just encountered what many consider to be the world's very first buttons, but they don't actually do any buttoning. They are all style and no substance, the beautiful ancestors of the functional object we know today. This is the very heart of a quiet, long-standing debate among archaeologists. Can you truly call an object a button if its function is solely ornamental? It's a question of form versus function. The shape is there, a disc with holes for attachment, but the purpose, the mechanical genius of the button and buttonhole system, is completely absent. Calling it a button is a bit like calling a drawing of a wheel a form of transportation. For now, you watch as a woman walks by, her dark tunic adorned with similar discs, these ones made of a soft, greyish stone, carved with intricate geometric patterns, a series of concentric circles on one, a cross-hatch design on another. They are beautiful, miniature works of art. You wander through the bustling marketplace and find the workshop of a craftsman who makes these very objects. He sits cross-legged on a mat, a small drill in his hand. You watch, mesmerized, as he takes a small, rough piece of steatite, what we would call soapstone, and begins to carve. The stone is soft, yielding easily to his sharp flint tools. He doesn't carve a face or an animal, but a precise geometric shape, a pattern of lines and dots that seems almost mathematical. This is a quirky little piece of ancient chemistry. It is soft and easy to work, but the craftsman isn't finished. Once the carving is done, he will place these little discs in a kiln. The intense heat will bake them hard, turning them from fragile stone into a durable, almost ceramic-like material, preserving his art for millennia. Some scholars have speculated that perhaps these objects had a secondary use, maybe as seals to press into clay to mark ownership of goods. It's a plausible idea in a complex trading society like this. You could imagine a merchant pressing his unique, geometrically patterned button into a wet clay tag on a bale of cotton, but there's little direct evidence for this. The most prevailing theory remains that their primary purpose was adornment, a way to add personality and perhaps status to clothing. The number you wore, The material they were made from, gleaming shell versus common stone, could say something about who you were. So you stand there, in the heat of this ancient, incredibly advanced city, looking at this object that is so close, yet so far from being a true button. The Indus Valley civilization had the technology. They had the artistry. They created these perfect little discs with holes in them, objects that were practically begging to be pushed through a slit in the fabric. But the idea, that final, crucial leap of imagination, just wasn't there. It was a technological near-miss. They had invented the hardware, but not the software to run it. The world would have to wait for the concept to be forgotten and then, thousands of years later, reinvented somewhere else entirely. For now, you just admire the quiet beauty of these useless little decorations, glinting in the sun. The dust of the Indus Valley dissolves into a bright, salty haze. The air grows clearer, cooler, carrying the scent of olives in the sea. You're standing on a sun-drenched stone plaza, surrounded by white columns and the murmur of a language that flows like music ancient Greek. You've jumped forward in time and space, landing right in the heart of the classical world. The people drifting past you are wrapped in voluminous fabrics, the famous Greek chiton and himation. The cloth isn't cut and sewn to fit the body. It's draped, folded, and pleated with an artistry that makes each person a walking sculpture. You look closely at how these garments are held together. Just like the earlier inhabitants of Europe, they rely on pins, but here they are often elegant brooches, predecessors to the Roman fibula. They are functional, necessary clasps that secure the flowing robes at the shoulder. You scan the crowd, looking for anything resembling the little discs from Mohenjo-Daro. You find nothing. The idea of a button, even a purely decorative one, seems to have vanished from the world, a forgotten dream. Now, let the scene shift again. The marble becomes grander, the crowd more boisterous. You're in Rome, the magnificent, chaotic capital of a burgeoning empire. The toga is the uniform of the citizen, a massive semi-scroll of heavy wool that requires careful, almost architectural, arrangement. A wealthy senator glides by, his toga flawlessly white, held in place at his shoulder by a gleaming gold fibula. It's been safely tucked away in its cuff. This is still the dominant technology. Practicality rules. But then you see it, on the tunic of a wealthy merchant, peeking out from beneath his toga. He's a row of small, golden knobs running along his cuff. They sparkle in the sun. They look, for all the world, like buttons. You move a little closer, feigning interest in a nearby market stall to get a better look. They are exquisite. Each one is a small dome of solid gold with a tiny, masterfully carved portrait of an eagle in the center. But as you observe how he moves, you notice something crucial. There are no buttonholes. The cuff is sewn shut. These golden knobs are sewn directly onto the surface of the fabric. They are, once again, beautiful, expensive impostors. These are not fasteners. They are jewelry, pure and simple. They serve the exact same function as a modern -day designer logo, an un-verbal declaration of wealth and taste. For a Roman, whose clothing was deceptively simple in its cut, adornment was everything, and these but un-like objects were a prime way to display that. You might see studs of polished amber, imported at great expense from the Baltic, or deep blue lapis lazuli from the far reaches of Afghanistan. They were the ancient equivalent of diamond cufflinks, all showing no girth. Here, you stumble upon a fascinating mishcraft. You see a man whose tunic is adorned with what look like dark red gemstones. A closer look reveals that each one has a detailed image engraved into it. Its surface a tiny portrait of the Emperor Augustus. This is a intaglio, a miniature work of art carved into a gemstone. These weren't just decorations. They were also functional seals. The owner could press this button into hot wax to seal a letter or a document, leaving his unique mark. It was a signature and a piece of jewelry all in one. It's a wonderfully clever bit of multitasking. But it still isn't a button. The idea of pushing it through the fabric to fasten something is still a world away. And this is where historians get into quiet, but persistent, arguments. The mainstream view is that these objects were purely decorative or, at best, served this secondary purpose as a seal. But some wonder if we're missing something. Could there have been some obscure, lost form of clothing, perhaps used by a specific profession or for an auxiliary in the army, that used a single, but unminus-like toggle? Or, more tantalizingly, did the meaning of these ornaments run deeper than we think? During the turbulent years of the late Republic, as factions vied for power, was wearing an ornament with Julius Caesar's portrait a subtle, or even dangerous, pledge of allegiance? Could the choice between a simple bronze stud and a carnelian intaglio of the god Mars signal your political leanings to those in the know? We have no definitive texts that say, to show you support the optimates, wear a lapis stud. The evidence is circumstantial, leaving scholars to debate whether these were just fashion choices or coded visual language of power that we can no longer fully understand. For all their incredible engineering, their aqueducts, their paved roads, their massive amphitheaters, the Romans, like the people of the Indus Valley before them, never made the conceptual leap to the button and buttonhole. They literally held the button in their hands. They perfected its artistic form, and they sewed it onto their clothes, but they never asked it to do a job. The world's most powerful empire was held together by pins and sashes, while the potential for a more secure, more elegant solution lay dormant, masquerading as a simple piece of jewelry. The revolution was still waiting for its moment. The grandeur of Rome fades, the polished marble and bright sunlight dissolving into a cooler, dimmer world. The air now smells of damp earth, wood smoke, and wet wool. You find yourself in what feels like 13th century Germany. The stone walls of the buildings are thick and the windows are small, letting in only slivers of the pale northern light. Life here feels heavier, more constrained by the seasons. The clothing reflects this. You're back in a loose fitting tunic, belted at the waist, perhaps with another longer tunic layered over it for wool. It's practical, it keeps the cold out, but it's shapeless. You are, essentially, wearing a well-constructed sack. You hold it closed, once again, with a brooch at the neck or by lacing the front together with a leather thong. But there's a restlessness in the air, a new idea rippling through the courts and towns of Europe. It's the desire for a different silhouette. Nobility and the burgeoning merchant class are no longer content with being draped in fabric. They want clothes that show off the human form, that fit snugly around the torso and arms. It's the dawn of tailoring as we know it, the beginning of a move away from simple rectangles of cloth and towards complex, shaped pattern pieces. You see the first signs of this change on the sleeves of a young nobleman. They are incredibly tight, so tight it looks like his arms were somehow bored into them. To get them on, the sleeve is left open along the forearm and painstakingly laced shut every single morning. It looks sharp, defining the line of his arm. But my goodness, is it inconvenient? You watch his squire spend a good 10 minutes carefully threading a cord through a dozen tiny, stitched eyelets. Now, you step into the workshop of a tailor. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax, said linen thread and hot irons. Scraps of wool and linen are everywhere. The tailor, a man with keen eyes and clever hands, is frowning at a sleeve he is making. He knows the fashion demands a tight fit, but he is tired of the lacing. It's time consuming for his wealthy clients under fiddle to mate. He wants something faster, sleeker. He picks up a small toggle, perhaps a carved piece of deer antler or a polished river stone. People have been using these for centuries as simple fasteners on bags and pouches. A toggle on a cord that you slip through a leather loop. It's an old, rustic idea, but the tailor looks from the toggle to the slit in the sleeve, and a new thought clicks into place. What if you didn't need the cord? What if you could just push the toggle directly through a hole on the other side? He takes a knife and makes a small, horizontal cut in the opposing piece of fabric. He tries to push the antler toggle through. It works, but the result is clumsy. The raw edges of the cut wool are weak. They begin to stretch and fray almost immediately. After a few uses, it will be a ragged, ugly hole. It's a failure. But the tailor doesn't give up. He is a craftsman. He knows fabric. He knows its weaknesses. Ray- threads his needle and goes back to that ugly little slit. This time, he begins to meticulously encase the raw edge with thread. He doesn't just whip it over and over. He uses a special, interlocking stitch, a tiny, close-set loop of thread that pulls on the loop before it, creating a strong, raised border. It's the invention of the buttonhole stitch, the unsung hero of this entire story. It's a simple, yet genius, piece of textile engineering that turns a weak point into a strong one. It transforms a fraying gash into a tidy, durable, and purpose-built gateway. This is the mainstream historical fact. The functional but buttonhole system exploded onto the scene in 13th century Germany, precisely because of this tiny innovation. The button itself was nothing new. Decorative knobs had been around for millennia. The real game changer was this small, reinforced slit in the fabric. He finishes the stitching. The hole is now a neat, firm little eyelet. He pushes the antler toggle through. It slips in securely. He gives it a tug. It holds. He does another, and another, until a row of 10 small toggles runs up the forearm, each nestled in its own purpose-built home. It's a revelation. It's clean, it's fast, and it allows for a fit that is impossibly, perfectly snug. And this brings us to one of history's great chicken and egg debates, a question costume historians still love to ponder. Did the fashion for tight clothing create a desperate need for a new fastener, thus spurring the invention of the buttonhole? Or was the invention of the buttonhole a clever breakthrough that suddenly allowed tailors to create these form-fitting garments, which then became fashionable because they were now possible? We don't know for sure which was the primary driver, fashion's demand or technology's supply. What we do know is that once the idea took hold, it spread like wildfire. The simple, reinforced loop had arrived. It was the missing piece of the puzzle, the tiny bit of code that had eluded the Indus Valley, the Greeks, and the Romans. And with its arrival, the history of clothing and the little object we call the button was about to get very exciting. The quiet satisfaction of the German tailor's workshop begins to fade, and the scent of wood smoke gives way to something more complex, a mix of beeswax from polished floors, roasting meat from a great hall, and the faint, expensive perfume worn by courtiers. You've drifted forward a few decades, into the heart of the 14th century. The world has changed. That small, revolutionary idea, the reinforced buttonhole, has not just been adopted. It has conquered. You are standing in the gallery of a great castle, perhaps in France or Ducal Burgundy, looking down at the throng below, and the first thing that strikes you is the shape of people. For the first time in this entire journey, you see silhouettes that are definitively masculine and feminine. The gentle, unisex sack-like tunic is gone. In its place is a riot of tailoring, a celebration of the human form that was utterly impossible just a generation or two ago. Your eyes are drawn to the men. Their outfits are astonishing. They wear a garment you've never seen before, a padded and quilted double, known as a pourpoint or gipion. It sculpts the torso, cinches the waist, and puffs out at the chest, creating a powerful, athletic silhouette. And holding this entire fashionable construction together is a glittering, unbroken line of buttons. They are everywhere. Not just 3 or 4 to close a shirt. We're talking dozens. A row of them runs from the neck right down to the low waist, spaced so closely together they almost touch. More buttons march in a tight, parallel line from the elbow to the wrist, cinching the sleeve to the arm with a precision that lacing could never achieve. You see a knight talking to a lady, and even the sleeves of his outer garment, SOPPL, are extravagantly decorated with buttons from shoulder to cuff, even though they serve no functional purpose there at all. This is the great fashion revolution of the late Middle Ages, and it is entirely powered by the button. This new, body-conscious tailoring is the core historical point. The desire to show off a physique honed by tilting at tournaments or simply to appear youthful and vigorous drove a style that was impossible without a reliable, easy use fastening system. You couldn't wriggle into a double like that. It had to be opened up completely and then buttoned, piece by piece. molding it to your body. Getting dressed is no longer a simple act of pulling a tunic over your head. It's a process of assembly, and the sheer number of buttons became a status symbol in itself. This is a fun, quirky detail of the era. It wasn't just about having buttons. It was about having an absurd, ostentatious quantity of them. You might see a duke whose doublet is fastened with 100 silver buttons, each one hand cast and finished by a skilled artisan. Some surviving documents and Tamafeki show garments with buttons literally everywhere on the chest, the sleeves, the shoulders, even down the outside of the leg on tight fitting holes. It was the medieval equivalent of covering your car in crystals. It was pure, unapologetic peacocking. Interestingly, for a significant period, men's fashion was far more flamboyant and decorative than women's. It was the men who were strutting around in the most form-fitting, brightly colored, and button-encrusted outfits. So why this sudden, frantic explosion? This is a point of ongoing scholarly discussion. The simple answer is fashion. They knew exciting style emerged, and everyone with the means to do so jumped on the bandwagon. But some historians dig a little deeper, suggesting it reflects profound social shift. The 14th century was a time of immense upheaval, most notably the Black Death, which dramatically altered the economic landscape. A newly wealthy merchant class was emerging, flush with cash but lacking the old, inherited status of the landed aristocracy. This rising class couldn't easily buy a castle or a noble title, but they could compete in the arena of appearance. Land was a fixed, traditional symbol of power, but clothing, fabric, and, yes, buttons were liquid assets. You could display your newfound wealth directly on your body. Was this but unfrenzy? Then, a form of social warfare fought with textiles, a way for the nouveau rich to visually challenge the old guard by adopting and even exaggerating the latest courtly styles. Was the nobleman with 100 buttons trying to outdo the knight who had 50, who was in turn trying to distinguish himself from the merchant who could now also afford 50. It's a theory that paints the fashion craze not just as frivolous, but as a dynamic reflection of a society in flux. You watch as a young man struggles slightly to bend at the waist. His doubled so tightly, buttoned it acts almost like a corset. The button is no longer a humble fastener or a forgotten piece of jewelry. It is the very engine of high fashion, a unit of currency in the display of wealth, and the silent enabler of a whole new way of looking at the human body. It has arrived, and it is dazzling. The energy of the crowded great hall begins to coalesce, focusing on a single, brilliantly lit figure. The general excitement of the 14th century but uncrazed now seems almost quaint, like a charming local festival compared to the main event. You've drifted into the opulent heart of the Renaissance, perhaps the French court of the early 16th century, and the stakes of the button game have been raised to an almost unbelievable level. You are watching a Kingolds, say it's Francis I of France, a man famous for his patronage of the arts and his spectacular sense of style. H.E.S. dressed for a state occasion. Perhaps to meet a rival monarch or a powerful ambassador. He is wearing a doubleton coat of rich, dark velvet, a fabric so expensive it shimmers like liquid night under the candlelight. But it's not the velvet that holds your gaze. It's the buttons. Forget the simple pewter or fabric covered buttons you might have seen on lesser mortals. This is on another plane of existence entirely. From his neck to his waist, in a dazzling light, are buttons of pure, solid gold, not just a few dozen, not even 100. One famous account credits King Francis I with commissioning a single black velvet garment adorned with, and this is the historical record, 13,600 gold buttons. Pause for a moment, try to picture that. Imagine the sheer weight of it, the feeling of wearing a flexible, shimmering coat of armor made of pure money. Each tiny button was individually cast, chased, and polished by a master goldsmith, then painstakingly sewn on by a royal tailor. This is the central truth of this era for the ultra-elite. Buttons had transcended fashion and become treasury assets. They were no longer about closing a garment. They were about displaying a kingdom's wealth on a single human body. You watched the king move, and you can almost hear the soft, heavy clinking of his attire. Each button is a miniature sculpture, perhaps bearing his royal insignia or a tiny, intricate floral design. And here you encounter a niche detail that is almost comical in its extravagance. Buttons weren't always solid. Some were tiny, hollow spheres of gold filigree, designed to hold a tuft of cotton soaked in perfume, releasing a fragrant cloud with every movement. Others were miniature lockets, containing a microscopic painted portrait of a loved one, a secret kept literally close to the heart. Or more likely, the rest. You could find buttons made from carved rock crystal, from hand-minus painted enamel depicting mythological scenes, from giant, irregular pearls imported from the New World at phenomenal cost. A single button on a nobleman's sleeve could be worth more than a farmer's entire plot of land. They were, in essence, wearable bank vaults. Naturally, losing one was a small minor-scale catastrophe. You can imagine a frantic search on hands and knees through the castle rushes after a royal banquet, a whole team of servants looking for a single errant button that was worth more than their combined yearly wages. This staggering level of opulence leads to a fascinating historical debate that still echoes among scholars of the period. What was the ultimate point of this button brinkmanship? The most straightforward interpretation is that it was simply the ultimate expression of personal vanity and conspicuous consumption. A king and his court engaging in a flamboyant contest of who was more. It was the Renaissance, after all, a time that celebrated individual magnificence. But another, more political theory argues that this was a calculated instrument of statecraft. When Francis I met with Henry VI of England at the Field of the Cloth of Gold, both kings and their entire retinue were dressed in clothes so laden with gold thread and jewels that the event's name became literal. Was this just a party, or was it a form of political posturing, an ominous verbal message to the world? A king who could afford to dress himself in what amounted to a portable gold mine was a king who could also afford to fund armies, build navies, and wage long, expensive wars. It was a way of projecting immense power without ever drawing a sword. It was meant to awe and intimidate rivals, both foreign and domestic. Furthermore, some historians argue it was also a tool for controlling the nobility. By setting an impossibly high bar for courtly fashion, a king could force his powerful dukes and barons to spend their fortunes trying to keep up, bankrupting them on tailors and goldsmiths instead of on raising private armies to challenge his authority. It was a subtle, brilliant form of financial warfare fought in the wardrobe. We'll likely never know the precise balance of vanity versus strategy, but it's clear these were more than just fasteners. They were weapons in a silent, glittering war of perception. The humble button had become a jewel, a statement of power, and a piece of royal propaganda all in one. The glittering, golden court of Francis I begins to dim. The sheer, overwhelming opulence recedes, replaced by a more sober, yet equally fascinating, atmosphere. You're still in Renaissance Europe, but you've moved from the king's inner circle to the bustling streets of a prosperous city, maybe in Italy or the Netherlands. The air is filled with the sounds of commerce, of artisans hammering, merchants haggling, and the steady hum of a well-mannered, ordered society. You notice the clothing of the people around you. A wealthy cloth merchant walks by, his doublet made of fine wool, not velvet, and closed with a neat row of pewter buttons, polished to a soft gleam. A baker's wife has a bodice fastened with simple, carved wooden buttons. They are functional, they are tidy, but they are deliberately modest. The button is still very much a part of everyday life, but the wild, jewel-encrusted extravagance of the highest nobility seems a world away, and there's a reason for that. As you wander the streets, you see a notice posted on the door of the town hall. It's a long, dense block of text, but you can make out certain words: gold, silver, silk, velvet, pearls. This is a public proclamation of what historians call some petty laws. This is the core historical point of this era's button story for a time. Governments actively tried to legislate what people could not wear, right down to the materials of their buttons. These laws were essentially anti-luxury regulations. and they were surprisingly common across Europe for centuries. They were an attempt by the ruling class, the old nobility, and the church to put a brake on the social climbing of the newly rich merchant class. The idea was to maintain a clear, visible social hierarchy. Your station in life should be immediately obvious from your clothing. If anyone could wear silk doublets and silver buttons, how could you tell a respectable duke from a particularly successful wool trader? It was an attack on social mobility, a desperate attempt to keep the visual lines of class from blurring. So, the law might state, for example, that only individuals with an annual income over a certain threshold, or those belonging to a noble family, were legally permitted to wear buttons made of gold, silver, or precious stones. A merchant might be allowed pewter or bone, a craftsman might be restricted to wood or horn, and a peasant farmer, fabric minus covered buttons, or more likely, simple laces, would be all they were allowed. This leads to a wonderful, slightly absurd historical anecdote, the rise of the glorified buttonhole. Some cunning fashionistas, forbidden from wearing flashy buttons, would instead pour all their creative energy into the buttonholes. They would make them incredibly elaborate, stitching them with brightly colored silk thread in contrasting patterns, making the empty hole itself the focus of decoration. It was a clever, passive minus aggressive way of thumbing your nose at the law. You said I can't wear gold buttons, but you said nothing about making the hole for my boring wooden button look like a work of art. You could imagine the same to city officials, a sort of button police, strolling through the market square, their eyes scanning the crowds. They might stop a young man whose buttons seem a little too shiny. "Excuse me, sir, but are those buttons silver, or merely highly polished tin? Your guild status only allows for tin." It's a strange, almost comical image, but for the people living under these laws, it was a real source of anxiety. Being caught over minus button could result in a hefty fine, public shaming, or even the confiscation of the offending garment. Of course, this raises a debate that historians still find intriguing. How effective were these laws? Really, the sheer number of times these laws were issued, often with increasingly specific and angry language, suggests that they were widely ignored. People with money have always wanted to show it off, and they would find ways to skirt the rules. A merchant might have a legal set of bone buttons sewn on his everyday doublet, but a secret, extravagant set of silver ones hidden at home, ready to be sewn on for a private party. Some scholars argue that the laws were never truly about enforcement, but more about reinforcing a social ideal. They were a way for the authorities to publicly declare, this is the way society should be, even if they knew they couldn't fully stop a wealthy banker from looking a bit like a lord. Other historians suggest that the laws actually backfired by explicitly linking certain materials to high status. They may have made those forbidden items even more desirable, fueling a black market for fancy buttons and illegal silks. You walk away from the town hall, looking at the people around you with new eyes. Their simple buttons are not just simple buttons. They are a statement of compliance, a quiet adherence to the rigid social order. Or are they? Is that man's pewter just a little too bright? Is that woman's dress, technically legal, cut just a little too much like a noble woman's gown? The button has become more than a fastener, more than a jewel. It's now a tiny, a potent player in the ongoing tug minus war between social classes. A silent testament to a world obsessed with keeping everyone in their proper place. The city street with its posted laws and anxious citizens begins to feel too broad, too public. Your focus narrows, pulling you down a small, cobblestoned alleyway, darker and more concentrated than the main square. The air here changes again. It's thick with the sharp, metallic tang of hot metal, the acrid smoke from a small fort, the dusty scent of carved bone, and the sweet smell of beeswax used to polish horn. You have found your way into the beating heart of the industry, the street of the boutonnieres, the professional button minus makers. You peer into an open workshop. Inside, a master craftsman is teaching an apprentice how to cast a row of identical pewter buttons in a soapstone mold. The work is precise, methodical, and governed by a set of unwritten rules that seem to hang in the air. This is not just a job, it's a protected craft, fiercely guarded by one of the most powerful and specific organizations of the era, the Button Minus Makers Guild. The existence and power of these guilds is the central story here. Think of a guild as part exclusive club, part trade union, and part monopoly. To make and sell buttons for a living in this city, you had to be a member, and becoming a member was a long, arduous process. You would start as a young apprentice, like the boy you're watching, living and working under a master for years, often as many as 7 or 8. You would learn the trade from the ground up, from preparing the raw materials to the secret techniques of finishing and polishing that made your master's buttons the best in the city. Finally, to become a master yourself, you'd have to submit a masterpiece to the guild council, a perfect example of your work that proved you were worthy of joining their rank. This system ensured a high standard of quality. The guild set the prices, inspected the workshops, and guaranteed that a button sold by one of its members was a button made to last. But this power also had a darker, more controlling side. And here you stumble upon a truly bizarre and niche aspect of guild life. The intense internal rivalries and specialization. You might think the Button Minus Makers Guild was one big, happy family of craftsmen. It was not. It was a federation of fiercely territorial clans. In the workshop you're here observing, the master works exclusively with metal pewter, bronze, and sometimes silver. If you were to ask him to make you a button from wood, he would look at you with disdain. That was just not his specialty. It was the work of an entirely different guild, or at least a different, legally separate branch of his own. The horn and bone carvers had their own masters, their own apprentices, and their own secrets. A metal minus worker was forbidden from working with wood. A wood minus worker was forbidden from casting metal. This was done to protect each craftsman's livelihood, ensuring no single, ambitious button minus maker could corner the entire market. The most bitter and prolonged feud, however, was not between button minus makers, but between the button minus makers and the tailors. It started innocently enough. A tailor, finishing a woolen doublet, would use the leftover scraps of fabric to create a simple, cloth minus covered button. It was thrifty and it matched the garment perfectly. The Button Minus Makers Guild went ballistic. They saw this as a direct threat to their existence. They argued, with complete seriousness, that a button was a button, regardless of material, and since they held the exclusive legal monopoly on making buttons, they contended that it was illegal for a tailor to make one, even out of his own cloth scraps. This kicked off decades of lawsuits and lobbying in cities across Europe. The Button Minus Makers petitioned kings and city councils, demanding that tailors be banned from producing their own buttons. The tailors argued, reasonably enough, that a little disc of wood covered in fabric was part of the garment's construction, not a separate, specialized item. It's a slightly ridiculous image, powerful. Serious men in robes arguing passionately before a judge about the legal definition of a button, but it was a deadly serious economic turf war. This entire system raises a question that historians of craft and technology still debate. Were these guilds the guardians of quality, or were they fundamentally brakes on innovation? On one hand, the guild system undeniably preserved traditional skills at a very high level. The quality control was real. When you bought a Guild Minus approved button, you knew it wouldn't fall apart. But, on the other hand, this rigid structure actively fought against change. Imagine you were a clever craftsman who had a brilliant new idea, a button that combined a metal base with a carved wooden inlay. It would be beautiful, unique, and unlike anything else on the market. But you couldn't make it. The Metal Minus Workers Guild would accuse you of doing woodwork, and the Wood Minus Workers Guild would accuse you of doing metalwork. Your innovation would be strangled in its cradle by bureaucracy and professional jealousy. The guild system was designed to create stability and predictability, not disruption and novelty. It protected the livelihoods of its members, but it may have also delayed the adoption of new materials and cheaper production methods for decades, if not centuries. You leave the narrow alleyway, realizing that the simple button on a cuff was once the focal point of immense pride, bitter legal battles, and a deep minus seated resistance to change. The claustrophobic, smoky air of the guild workshop dissolves, and you find yourself breathing in the fresh, clean scent of a forest floor after rain. You've stepped away from the cities, from the courts, from the fierce politics of artisans and merchants. The world around you is quieter, greener, and far less complicated. You're in a rural village. A small collection of thatched minus-roof cottages nestled in a rolling landscape. This is the world where the vast majority of people lived, far from the dictates of high fashion and the watchful eye of the button police. You are standing beside a farmer as he mends a tear in his rough, homespun linen shirt. His hands are calloused and strong, accustomed to the rhythms of the land, not the delicate work of a city tailor. He needs to fasten his shirt closed against the morning chill. H.E.S. not thinking about status or style. H.E.S. thinking about practicality. He walks over to the woodpile stacked against his cottage and picks up a small, fallen branch of hazel wood. With a simple utility knife, he slices off a thin, disc-minus-like section. He smooths the edges slightly, then drills 2 rough holes through the center with the point of his knife. It's not perfectly round, it's not polished, but when sewn onto a shirt, it will do the job perfectly. This is the central reality of the button for most of human history. For every one gold button worn by a king, there were millions, perhaps billions, of humble buttons made from simple, organic materials. They are the silent majority of the button world, rarely preserved in museums and almost never mentioned in royal inventories. But they are the ones that kept most people's clothes together for centuries. You look around the small cottage, tucked away in a wooden box. You see a small collection of these homemade fasteners. There are more of the simple wooden discs, some blackened slightly from being close to the hearth fire. But there are other materials too. This is where you encounter the forgotten creativity of the common folk. You see a button carved from the knuckle bone of a sheep, salvaged after a meal. It's been boiled clean and polished against a piece of leather until it has a smooth, ivory minus-like finish. It's surprisingly beautiful, a smooth, luminous object created from something that would otherwise have been discarded. Next to it is a darker, more textured button. This one was carefully sawn from the base of a deer's antler, found shed in the forest. The porous, intricate pattern of the antlers provides a natural decoration. It's sturdy, lightweight, and completely free. You also see buttons made from horn. A craftsman, perhaps a traveling tinker who visited the village once a year, would take a cow's horn, heat it over a flame until it became soft and pliable, and then press it flat. When schooled, this flat sheet of horn could be cut, carved, and polished into durable, translucent buttons that glowed with a warm, amber light. This was a form of rustic alchemy, transforming a part of an animal into something of utility and quiet beauty. And this brings up a small, but fascinating, point of historical debate among textile experts and social historians. We tend to think of pre-industrial fashion as filtering exclusively from the top down. An idea starts at court and slowly, over decades, trickles down in simplified form to the common people. But was it always that one way? Could some ideas have bubbled up from below? Imagine, for instance, a wealthy lord traveling through his lands. This is the unique, rugged texture of an antler button on one of his tenants. H.C.S. never seen anything like it. His courtly buttons are all shiny metal and polished stone. Could he have been intrigued by this rustic, authentic look and commissioned a set for his own hunting double? We don't have direct proof of this bottom-up fashion influence, but it's a compelling idea. It challenges the traditional narrative and suggests a more complex interplay between social classes. Perhaps the folk aesthetic, born of necessity and available materials, occasionally became a source of inspiration for the elite, a way to signal a connection to the countryside, to manlines, or to a more honest way of life. It's the ancient equivalent of a modern billionaire wearing distressed jeans to look more grounded and approachable. For now, you watch the farmer sew on his new hazel wood button. He isn't trying to impress anyone. H.E.S. not worried about guild regulations. He is simply solving a problem with the materials that the world has offered him. His button tells a story not of wealth or power, but of resilience, resourcefulness, and a deep connection to the natural environment. It's a reminder that history isn't just made in castles and council chambers. It's also made in quiet cottages, with a simple knife and a fallen branch, by ordinary people just trying to stay warm. The scent of the damp European forest floor fades. The image of the resourceful farmer with his hazel minus wood button dissolving like a dream. The world shifts, not in location at first, but in texture and light. You're no longer looking at things made from the land, but from the water. The object in your mind's eye is cool, smooth, and heavy in your palm. It shimmers with an internal, milky fire, a captured rainbow that shifts from pink to green to blue as you tilt it in the light. This is mother minus of minus pearl, or nacre, the iridescent lining of a mollusk shell. For centuries, it was a luxury material, a sliver of oceanic magic used for inlay in furniture and jewelry. But you're about to witness it become the king of buttons. The scene solidifies. You're in late 19th minus century America. The air is thick with humidity and the slow, earthy smell of a massive river. You are standing on the muddy banks of the Mississippi, in a town like Muscatine, Iowa. A few decades ago, this was a quiet river town. Now, it's a boom town, but the gold isn't in the ground, it's in the water. This is the epicenter of the American freshwater mussel rush, or frenzy, industrial minus scale treasure hunt that would, for a time, make this small town the pearl button capital of the world. This is the main historical point, a massive, profitable industry built entirely on the shells of humble river mussels. It all started when a German immigrant named John Bopel, who knew the craft of making buttons from shell in his home country, realized that the thick minus shelled mussels of the Mississippi basin were a perfect raw material. He set up a small, clandestine workshop, and soon the secret was out. The rush was on. You watched the sea lammers, as they were called, poling their flat minus bottom boats, or jan boats, through the slow minus moving current. It's tough, back minus breaking work. You see men wading in the shallows, feeling for the mussels with their bare feet. But the most ingenious and slightly bizarre method is the one you see being used from the boats. This is the quirky detail of the industry, the crowfoot bar. It's a long iron bar, sometimes up to 20 feet, from which hang dozens of chains with dull, for minus sprung hooks. The sea llama drags this contraption along the riverbed. When a hook touches a mussel, its natural instinct is to clamp shut on the foreign object. The sea llama then raises the bar, heavy with its clinging, living cargo. All day they work, filling their boats with thousands of mussels. They aren't really looking for precious pearls, though finding one was a lottery minus win bonus. The real treasure was the shell itself. In the evenings, you see them gathered on the riverbank around huge, steaming vats of boiling water. They dump the mussels in to cook them open, a process that fills the air with a distinct, fishy smell. They pry out the meat, most of which was discarded or used as hog feed, and toss the empty shells into massive, shimmering piles that could grow to be several stories high. Mountains of pure potential. From these mountains of shell, the industry rose. You step inside one of the button factories that now line the riverfront. The air is cool and dusty, and the noise is a deafening, constant clatter. You watch the process. A worker takes a shell and holds it against a whirring, steam minus powered tubular saw, cutting out rough discs, called blanks. Then another worker sorts these blanks by thickness. Then another grinds them to a uniform shape. Another drills the holes. Finally, they are tumbled in tumescent water, and then polished with chemicals in a final, rotating cast, a process that awakens the deep, iridescent luster within. Billions upon billions of these gleaming white buttons poured out of Muscatine, sewn onto shirts, dresses, and coats all across America and the world. But this frantic boom couldn't last forever, and the precise reason for its decline is a matter of some debate among economic and environmental historians. The most obvious culprit was environmental collapse. The sea lammers had been too successful. They had over-harvested the mussel beds on a catastrophic scale, pulling them out of the river far faster than they could naturally reproduce. By the 1930 seconds and 40 seconds, entire species of mussels were nearing extinction. The river simply ran out of shells. However, another force was at play, a technological one. While the mussel population was crashing, chemists in laboratories were perfecting a revolutionary new material, plastic. Early plastics like bakelite could be produced cheaply, in vast quantities, and in any color imaginable. They didn't have the natural, watery shimmer of mother minus pearl, but they were durable and incredibly versatile. Was the pearl but an industry killed by its own greed and environmental short-sightedness? Or was it simply made obsolete by superior modern technology? The consensus is that it was a fatal 1-2 punch. The environmental crisis made the raw material scarce and expensive. Right at the moment a cheaper, more reliable alternative appeared on the market. The plastic button delivered the final death knell. The noise of the factory fades. The great mountains of shell are gone, used up long ago. The pearl button, once the undisputed king, becomes a specialty item, a vintage classic. You hold one in your mind one last time, cool, smooth, beautiful, a relic of a lost American boomtown and a silent witness to a river's bounty and its eventual exhaustion. The loud, industrial clatter of the Iowa button factory dissolves into a delicate, crystalline chime. You have left the muddy banks of the Mississippi and traveled back in time, landing in the refined, almost fairy tale atmosphere of 18th-century Europe. The air is clear and cool, and the light seems sharper, more focused. You're standing in a lavishly decorated room, a salon in Paris or Vienna, where aristocratic ladies and gentlemen are gathered for an evening of music and conversation. Their clothing is a confection of silk, satin, and lace. The men wear elegantly embroidered waistcoats and velvet coats, the women in gowns with wide panniers and impossibly intricate details. And as they move in the flickering candlelight, you see flashes of brilliant, colored light coming from their garments. You look closer and realize you're seeing something entirely new. Their buttons are not made of metal, or shell, or wood. They are made of glass. This is the main historical point of this chapter, the rise of the glass button as a high-minus fashion art form. This wasn't the simple, practical glass you'd find in a window pane. This was the work of the master glass makers of Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic and Venice. Artisans who had perfected the creation of intensely colored, jewel-like glass. They could produce deep sapphire blues, rich ruby reds, and brilliant emerald greens that rivaled the real gemstones. For a noble who couldn't afford a coat fastened with actual sapphires, a set of expertly crafted Bohemian glass buttons was the next best thing. You watch as a countess gestures with her fan. The buttons on her silken cuffs are not simple discs. Each one is a miniature masterpiece. One might be a deep blue glass oval, with a tiny, perfect white flower a daisy, or a forget-me not embedded within the glass itself. This is a technique called lamp-pot, where a craftsman uses a hot flame originally from an oil lamp to melt and shape rods of colored glass, creating tiny, intricate sculptures that are then fused into the button. Another gentleman might have waistcoated buttons of black glass, each one expertly faceted like a black diamond, catching the light with every breath. And now you come across a truly strange and wonderful niche in the world of glass buttons, the paperweights. These weren't for holding down papers. They were buttons constructed like their larger, desk-bound cousins. The glassmaker would arrange a tiny bouquet of intricate glass flowers and leaves a millefiori 1,000-flowers arrangement, and then encase it in a dome of clear, magnifying crystal. The result was a tiny, self-contained world under glass, a miniature greenhouse that you could wear on your coat. They were breathtakingly beautiful and phenomenally difficult to make. You also see buttons that are, essentially, painted canvases. A craftsman would take a flat disc of opaque white or black glass and hand-paint a miniature, seen onto white, a pastoral landscape with shepherds and sheep, a portrait of a lover, or a scene from a popular opera. This painting would then be sealed with a thin layer of clear glass to protect it. Owning a set of these was like wearing a portable art gallery. It was a way to display, not just your wealth, but your culture and sophisticated taste. This explosion of artistic glass buttons raises a question that collectors and historians still puzzle over. Where is the line between a craft object and a piece of fine art? We traditionally think of art as paintings on a wall or sculptures on a pedestal. But when a glassmaker achieves the level of artistry you're witnessing, creating a tiny, perfect sculpture or a detailed miniature painting that just happens to be on a button, is it any less of an artistic achievement? Some art historians argue that the functional nature of a button will always place it in the category of decorative arts or craft. It's an object made for a purpose, not purely for aesthetic contemplation. But others challenge this view. They argue that this is an outdated, snobbish distinction. If a piece shows mastery of technique, originality of vision, and emotional resonance, what does it matter if it's on a canvas or on a cuff? The debate highlights our own biases about what constitutes serious art. It's a discussion about whether an object's utility inherently diminishes its artistic value. You can imagine two nobles at the party, one with waistcoat buttons of solid gold, the other with buttons featuring a hand-minus painted scene from mythology. The gold buttons shout, "I am rich." The glass buttons whisper, "I am rich, and I am also a man of culture and refined taste." It was a new, more subtle way of communicating status. The glass button craze was a perfect expression of the Rococo spirit of the 18th century, playful, ornate, and exquisitely detailed. It was a moment when a purely functional object was elevated to a form of high art, a tiny canvas for demonstrating both wealth and wit. You admire a set of buttons made to look like tiny, ripe strawberries, so realistic you could almost eat them. The humble button had once again reinvented itself, this time as a sparkling, fragile, and utterly enchanting jewel of glass. The sparkling, candle-minus lit salon of the 18th century begins to lose its focus. The transparent, jewel-minus-like brilliance of glass fades, replaced by something more solid, more earthy, yet no less artistic. You feel a shift from the fragile and flamboyant to the cool and classical. You've moved from the glass-minus blower's flame to the potter's kiln. You find yourself in England, in a place that is part artist's studio, part scientist's laboratory, and part bustling factory. The air smells of damp clay, intense heat, and industrial ambition. This is the world of high-end ceramics, and its masters are turning their attention to the humble button. You might just meet the man himself, Josiah Wedgwood, a potter, an inventor, and a man with a brilliant marketing mind. He wasn't just making mugs and plates. He was creating some of the most iconic decorative arts of the era. And this is the core point of our story now, how these great pottery houses applied their grand artistic visions to this miniature canvas. Wedgwood is most famous for his invention of jasperware, and you can see a slab of it cooling on a workbench. It's not shiny or glazed. It has a unique, stony, unglazed texture, fine, matte finish that begs to be touched, and the color is unmistakable soft, pale blue, a shade so iconic it is known to this day simply as Wedgwood blue. Applied to the surface of this blue are delicate, raised figures in pure white seen from a Greek myth, a classical goddess, a Roman emperor. The style is restrained, elegant, and deeply influenced by the recent archaeological discoveries at Pompeii and Herculaneum. It is the height of neoclassical taste. Now, imagine that same artistry, that same cool elegance, shrunk down to the size of your thumbnail. You see a tray of finished buttons, ready to be sewn onto the waistcoat of a fashionable gentleman. Each one is a tiny disc of that signature Wedgwood blue, adorned with a perfect, miniature white cameo, a tiny goddess of wisdom, Athena, Friscona, a delicate depiction of the three graces for a lady's dress. They are exquisite. They are not flashy like glass. They are confident, understated, and speak of immense good taste. They transformed the button into a tiny piece of classical sculpture. But Wedgwood wasn't the only player in the game, and this is where you find a fascinating and slightly more whimsical side of the ceramic but unworld transfer printing. Think of it like a sophisticated temporary tata for pottery. An artist would engrave a detailed design onto a copper plate. This plate was then inked, and the design was transferred onto a special, thin tissue paper. This ink paper was then carefully laid onto an unfired ceramic button blank. With pressure, the ink design moved from the paper to the ceramic. The button was then glazed and fired, making the design permanent. This technique allowed for an incredible level of detail that was impossible to achieve with hand-painting on such a small scale. You could have a button featuring a tiny, perfect rendering of a famous castle, or a delicate spray of botanically correct flowers, but it also allowed for more playful designs. You might find a set of waistcoat buttons showing different breeds of dogs, or a series depicting scenes from a popular play. Our niche, quirky detail for this section is that you could even find buttons with comical scenes, a monkey dressed as a gentleman playing a tiny flute, or a political cartoon satirizing a public figure. It was a way to wear your interests, your sense of humor, or even your political allegiances, right there on your coat. This dual existence of high-end ceramic buttons the sculptural art of Wedgwood versus the printed detail of transfer leads to a question that business historians and art historians still discuss. What was the primary motivation for a company like Wedgwood to produce buttons? One school of thought argues that it was simply a profitable product line. Buttons were a necessary luxury good, and a wealthy client who was ordering a full Jasperware dinner service would gladly add a set of matching buttons for his coat to the order. They were a small but logical part of a comprehensive luxury goods business. But another, more cynical and perhaps more modern interpretation suggests they were a brilliant marketing tool. A lady might not have the means to purchase a large, expensive Wedgwood urn, but she could afford a set of 12 buttons. By wearing these buttons, she became a walking advertisement for the brand. She was displaying the Wedgwood name and aesthetic to her entire social circle. The buttons were a gateway, an accessible entry point into the world of a luxury brand. They might have been sold at a low margin, or even as a loss-minus leader, with the understanding that they would build brand loyalty and lead to larger, more profitable purchases down the road. Was it art? Or was it advertising? Was it a product? Or was it a promotion? The truth is likely a bit of both, but it shows the sophisticated commercial thinking that was emerging at the dawn of the industrial age. The button was no longer just a fastener or a jewel. It was now potentially a tiny, ceramic billboard. The refined, almost sterile quiet of the Wedgwood studio, with its classical cameos and delicate artistry, begins to be drowned out by a new sound. It starts as a low rumble, then grows into a deafening, rhythmic roar of gears, pistons, and steam. The smell of clay and kilns is replaced by the smell of hot oil, coal smoke, then draw, powerful industry. You have been pulled from the craftsman's workshop into the heart of the Industrial Revolution in 19th century Britain. The world is getting faster, louder, and everything is about to change for our humble button. You are standing on the factory floor of a sprawling brick building in a city like Birmingham or Manchester. This is no longer about a single master creating one perfect button at a time. This is about thousands, millions, of buttons being churned out with relentless, mechanical efficiency. The individual artisan, with his years of training and his secret technique, is being replaced by the machine. This is the fundamental historical shift mass production arrives. Before, every button was, to some degree, unique, even in a set. Tiny variations were inevitable. Now, you watch as a massive, steam-powered press stamps out perfect, identical metal, button blanks from a sheet of brass, hundreds per minute. Clank minus thump, clank minus thump, clank minus thump. The sound is hypnotic and inhuman. You see another machine that takes these blanks and, with a series of automated punches and dies, shapes them, curls their edges, and punches the holes for the thread, or more likely, stamps a metal loop, the shank, onto the back. The process is broken down into simple, repetitive tasks, performed by workers who need no artistic skill, only the endurance to keep up with the pace of the machine. This new industrial scale made buttons cheaper and more accessible than ever before. A middle-class office clerk could now afford a coat with a full set of smart, well-made metal buttons that would have been a luxury item a century earlier. The button was democratized. It was no longer a reliable indicator of immense wealth, but a standard feature on almost all clothing. And in this new industrial landscape, you find a weird and wonderful niche innovation, the vegetable ivory button. It sounds like a contradiction, but it was a real and hugely popular material. In the rainforests of South America grows the togwa palm tree. Its seeds, or nuts, are about the size of a small hen's egg. When fresh, they are soft and edible, but when dry, the albumin inside the nut hardens into a substance that is incredibly dense, white, and hard. It looks, feels, and carves almost exactly like elephant ivory. Vast quantities of these nuts were shipped to the button factories of Europe and America. You watch as workers feed the dried nuts into lathes, which shave them down into button shapes. Because it was a natural material, each button had a unique, subtle grain, but they could be mass produced with the efficiency of the machine age. And most importantly, they could be dyed. You see huge vats where the finished buttons are soaked, turning them into a rainbow of colors. Vegetable ivory became the go-to material for high-quality buttons that were cheaper than shell or real ivory, but more elegant than plain wood or metal. It was the perfect middle-ground material for the new middle class. The advent of mass production, however, raises a complex debate that echoes to this day: the loss of soul in manufactured goods. Historians and social critics of the time, like John Ruskin and William Morris, looked at factories like the one you were in with a sense of horror. They saw this new industrial process as dehumanizing. They argued that the handmade object, with all its tiny imperfections, contained something of the spirit of its maker. The machine-made object, in its sterile perfection, was dead. It was efficient, yes, but it lacked character, history, and humanity. On the other hand, economic historians argue that this is a romantic and elitist view. Mass production, they counter, was a force for liberation. It freed the vast majority of people from having to wear rough, ill-fitting clothes fastened with a twig. It gave them access to dignity, to cleanliness, and to a small measure of fashion that was previously the exclusive domain of the rich. Was the factory a soulless monster destroying true craftsmanship? Or was it an engine of progress, bringing a better quality of life to millions? There is no easy answer, and the debate continues to frame how we think about everything from fast fashion to artisanal coffee. You watch a final, automated process where the finished buttons are polished by the thousands in a huge rotating drum filled with sawdust. The sound is a soft, continuous roll. The individual button has lost its preciousness. It is no longer a jewel, an artwork, or a carefully guarded craft secret. It has become a commodity, a tiny, interchangeable cog in the great, roaring machine of the modern world. The deafening, greasy clamor of the Birmingham factory fades. The roar of the steam-powered press is replaced by the sharp, rhythmic tramp of marching boots on a parade ground. The air now smells of polished leather, brass cleaner, and the crisp wool of a uniform. You stepped out of the world of civilian fashion into the highly regulated, symbolic world of the military. Here, the button is not just a fastener. It is a piece of equipment, a badge of identity, and an essential part of a soldier's life and death. You are watching a line of infantrymen standing at attention, perhaps British redcoats from the 18th century, or French soldiers from the Napoleonic Wars. Their uniforms are immaculate, and the most prominent feature is the rows of gleaming buttons that march across their chests and adorn their cuffs and collars. This is the central point: the military's adoption and standardization of the button for uniforms. These are not just any buttons. Each one is a small, but potent, piece of government-issued property. Look closely at the button on a soldier's coatee. It's made of pewter or brass, designed for durability above all else, and stamped into its face is a symbol: the royal crown, the regimental number, or the emblem of a specific corps, like the hunting horn of a light infantry unit. This button instantly identifies the wearer. It tells you his nation, his regiment, and his role. In the chaos of a black-powder battlefield, shrouded in smoke, These small, glittering discs could be the only way to distinguish friend from foe in close quarters combat. This leads to a fascinating ensemble little detail about the true utility of these buttons. They weren't just for identification. They were often the only hard, durable tool a soldier carried on his person. You can imagine a soldier in a quiet moment in camp, using the edge of his button to scrape mud from his musket's flintlock, or using it to burnish a strap of his leather equipment. And there's a grimmer, more intimate use. In the era before official dog tags, a soldier's buttons were his primary form of identification if he fell in battle. A burial detail would often cut a button from the uniform of an unknown soldier to return to his family, a final, metallic token of his service and sacrifice. A single, small button could be the only tangible thing a family had left of their son. The design and placement of these buttons could also have hidden, practical functions. The rows of buttons on the cuffs of a cavalryman's jacket might be placed very close together, making the cuff stiff to protect his wrist from a glancing sword blow. The large, closely spaced buttons on a sailor's peacoat provided an extra layer of wind proofing when buttoned up against a gale. The Navy, in particular, had its own lore, with buttons featuring fouled anchors and other nautical symbols, creating a distinct identity separate from the land-based armies. But the most famous and persistent military button story revolves around a single, powerful figure, Frederick the Great of Prussia. The story goes that Frederick, obsessed with discipline and the appearance of his troops, was annoyed that his soldiers kept wiping their noses on their uniform sleeve. To stop this unseemly habit, he ordered a row of non-functional buttons to be sewn onto the top of the cuffs. The idea was that if a soldier went to wipe his nose, the metal buttons wouldn't pleasantly scrape his face, breaking him of the habit. This is often cited as the origin of modern decorative cuff buttons on men's suits. This anecdote raises a classic historical puzzle. Is it true? Military historians and costume experts are still split on this. There's no definitive written order from Frederick demanding nose-wiping prevention buttons. The more likely, and far more boring, explanation is that the cuff buttons were simply a carry over from earlier styles when cuffs could actually be unbuttoned under or back. They remained as a decorative, traditional element long after their function was gone. The Frederick the Great story, however, is what historians call folklore story that is so good, so fitting to the character of its protagonist, that it persists even with little evidence. Does it matter if it's literally true? Some historians say yes. Facts are paramount. Others argue that the entrance of the story tells us something more important about how we perceive military culture as a world of extreme discipline, obsessive attention to detail, and slightly absurd solutions to human problems. The story might be false, but its truthiness reveals a deeper understanding of the military mindset. You watch the soldiers perform their drill, the sun glinting off their rows of identical buttons. These objects are no longer about personal choice or fashion. They are about uniformity, identity, and belonging to something larger than oneself. Each button is a tiny, shining cog in the great, disciplined machine of the army. The rigid, sun-baked parade ground softens and blurs. The sharp glint of military brass fades, and you find yourself indoors, perhaps in a well-appointed Victorian-era department store. The air is common smells of starched linen, new cotton. You're watching a husband and wife shopping for new shirts. The husband picks up a crisp, white shirt, and you notice the buttons are sewn on the right hand side of the garment. The wife examines a blouse, and you see her buttons are on the left. You've just stumbled upon one of the most persistent and quietly perplexing conventions in the history of clothing. This is our main topic for this section, the enduring and slightly bizarre tradition of men's and women's buttons being on opposite sides. It's a practice that has survived for centuries, long after its original reasons have been forgotten, and it continues to this day on most button-up garments. For men, the buttons are on the right blanket, and the buttonholes on the left. For women, it's the reverse. Why? This is the central question, and the honest answer is that nobody knows for sure. There is no single, universally accepted historical document that says, from this day forward, we shall decree buttons be gendered. Instead, we have a collection of competing theories, each with its own logic and its own holes, and the debate over which is correct continues among fashion historians to this day. The most popular and widely cited theory has to do with servants. It goes like this: a wealthy gentleman in, say, the 17th or 18th century would have dressed himself. Most people are right-handed, so having the buttons on the right side makes them easier to fasten. A wealthy lady, however, especially when wearing the complex, multi-layered gowns of the period, would have been dressed by a maid. For a right-handed maid standing in front of the lady, having the buttons on her right, the garments left would make them easier and faster to do up. The convention, therefore, is a relic of a class-based society, where men's clothing was designed for self-sufficiency and women's clothing was designed for assisted dressing. It sounds plausible, doesn't it? But there are problems with this theory. Firstly, it assumes that only women had help dressing, which isn't entirely true. Many wealthy men had vailets to assist them. Secondly, buttons were common on the clothing of women of all classes, long before this became a standardized rule, including on garments. They would certainly have fastened themselves. Why would a working class woman's blouse mimic the button placement of a duchess she would never meet? This leads us to another theory, which is less about class and more about biology. This one suggests the arrangement is for mothers nursing a baby. A right-handed mother would typically hold her baby in her left arm, leaving her dominant right hand free to open her blouse to breastfeed. Having the opening on the right side, buttons on the left, would be more natural and efficient. This is an ingenious theory, but again, it struggles to explain why the convention would apply to all women's garments, not just the ones a new mother might wear, and why it would have been adopted so universally. Now for a more obscure niche theory, and this one ties back to the military world we just left. Remember that men's doubles and coats in the age of swordsmanship needed to be accessible. A right-handed man drawing a sword from his left hip would want his coat to open cleanly. Having the right side overlap the left would prevent his sword hilt from snagging on the opening of his coat. It was a small, practical consideration for self-defense. Women, who were not expected to draw swords in polite society, had no such need, so their clothing could follow a different convention. Finally, there's the delightfully simple and slightly cynical market segmentation theory. This one posits that early clothing manufacturers in the 19th century, wanting to distinguish clearly between their men's and women's product lines, simply created an arbitrary difference. By putting buttons on opposite sides, they made it impossible for a woman to simply buy a cheaper, more plainly made man's shirt and pass it off as a woman's garment. It was a way of enforcing gendered fashion and, not coincidentally, ensuring their families had to buy two separate sets of clothing. It wasn't about history or tradition, but about pure, simple capitalism. So which one is it? The truth is, it might be a combination of these factors, or a reason that is now completely lost to us. The servant theory remains the most popular, but the academic world is far from a consensus. It's a perfect example of how a simple, everyday thing we take for granted can have a history that is surprisingly murky and contested. You leave the department store, perhaps glancing down at your own shirt, suddenly aware that this simple row of buttons is a silent participant in a historical mystery that has never been definitively solved. The Victorian department store, with its ordered world of natural fibers and its quiet, unsolved mystery of button placement, seems to melt away at the edges. The scent of cotton and wool is replaced by something sharp, chemical, and unfamiliar. You are no longer holding a shirt made of plant or animal material. You are in a different era, the turn of the 20th century, and you're re-holding a button that represents a fundamental break with the past. It looks exactly like a beautiful, translucent piece of tortoisile, with swirling patterns of amber and brown, but it feels wrong. It's too light, too warm to the touch, and its pattern is just a little too perfect. This is not the product of a living creature. This is a phantom, born in a laboratory. You have just encountered celluloid, the world's first successful semi-minus synthetic plastic. And this is our main point. The invention of these early plastics triggered a revolution that completely upended the button industry, making beautiful, imitative designs available to the masses at a stunningly low price. For thousands of years, a button's material had to be harvested from a tree, an animal, a shell, or a mine. Celluloid was different. It was concocted, a strange alchemy of nitrocellulose made from cotton and camphor. It was a material that could be molded, pressed, and, most importantly, made to look like almost anything. Suddenly, materials that were once the exclusive domain of the rich were available to everyone, at least in appearance. The factory you are in now is not carving rare tortoiseshell or precious ivory. It is stamping out sheets of celluloid that perfectly mimic them. You see trays of buttons that look like jet, like ember, like mother minus of minus pearl, even like lapis lazuli. It was a miracle of cheap imitation. A factory girl could now have a blouse with buttons there, from a distance, look just as luxurious as her employers. The visual codes of wealth that had been so carefully constructed for centuries began to dissolve. But this miracle material had a fiery, and frankly dangerous, little secret. This is our quirky, historical detail. Celluloid is incredibly flammable. You can imagine a gentleman in his new celluloid minus buttoned waistcoat, leaning over a candle to light his pipe. A moment of carelessness, the smoke from the fire, and his buttons wouldn't just melt, they could fizz, flare up, or even vanish in a tiny puff of smoke and flame. The material was so unstable that it was a known hazard in early movie theaters, where the film stock was made of the same stuff. This inherent flaw meant that while celluloid was popular, the search was on for something better, something more stable. The scene shifts slightly. The chaotic, imitative rainbow of celluloid is replaced by a more sober and serious material. You're in the workshop, or rather, the laboratory of Leo Bekeland, a Belgian chemist working in New York in the early 1900s. He wasn't trying to invent a new material for buttons. He was searching for a synthetic replacement for shot, a resin used for electrical insulation. What he created by mixing phenol and formaldehyde under pressure was a substance he called bakelite. It was heavy, hard, heat-minus resistant, and a fantastic electrical insulator. He marketed it as the material of 1,000 uses, and it truly was. Bakelite was used for everything: telephone casings, radio dials, pipe stems, kitchenware, and, of course, buttons. Unlike celluloid, bakelite couldn't imitate other materials as convincingly. It had its own distinct character. Early bakelite came in dark, somber colors: blacks, browns, deep reds, and olive greens. Its aesthetic was serious, modern, and industrial. A bakelite button didn't pretend to be ivory. It was proudly, unapologetically plastic. It was the color of the new machine age. The arrival of these two plastics, celluloid and bakelite, ticks off a debate that continues to this day. A question of authenticity versus democracy in design. On one side, historians and sociologists argue that plastics were a tremendous democratizing force. They shattered the old, rigid visual hierarchy. They allowed ordinary people to participate in fashion and beauty in ways that were previously impossible. They were a triumph of scientific ingenuity that brought pleasure and elegance to the many, not just the few. But another school of thought sees it differently. They argue that this was the beginning of a culture of fakeness. By celebrating imitation, did we devalue the real thing? Did the skill of the craftsman, who could carve real tortoiseshell, become less meaningful when a machine could stamp out 1,000 plastic copies in an hour? This perspective suggests that the rise of plastics, while convenient and cheap, marked a cultural shift towards valuing the surface appearance of things over their intrinsic quality and the human labor that went into them. Was it a democratization of luxury, or the birth of the disposable knock-minus-off? You look at the two buttons in your mind: the beautiful, flammable celluloid fake and the honest, industrial bakelite original. They weren't just fasteners, they were the heralds of a new, synthetic world, a world where the materials of our lives would no longer be limited by what we could find, but by what we could imagine in a test tube. The button was once again at the forefront of a revolution, this time a quiet, chemical one. The chemical scent of the bakelite laboratory fades, and you find yourself in the middle of the 20th century. The world is faster, noisier, and obsessed with a new kind of modern convenience. You're in a tailor's shop, but the conversation isn't about the cut of the cloth or the style of the button. It's about something new, something mechanical, something that threatens to make the button obsolete entirely. The tailor holds up a pair of trousers and, instead of unbuttoning the fly, he pulls a small metal tab with a sharp, metallic The trousers open. You have just met the button's greatest rival, zipper. This is the main event of our chapter, the dramatic rise of the zipper and the existential threat it posed to the button's long reign. The zipper wasn't invented overnight. Its early forms, patented in the late 19th century, were clumsy, unreliable, and prone to jamming. They were a novelty, not a serious competitor. But by the 1932, a Swedish minus American engineer named Gideon Sundback had perfected the design we know today. With its small, interlocking teeth, the modern zipper was born, and it was ready to fight for its place on our clothes. The early marketing campaigns for the zipper framed it as a marvel of modern efficiency. Buttons were old minus fashion, slow and fiddly. They could fall off and get lost. The zipper, on the other hand, was fast, secure, and futuristic. It was the closure for the modern man and woman on the go. An early ad campaign even gave the device its catchy, onomatopoeia name, the zipper. The first major breakthrough for the zipper was in outerwear. It was perfect for closing up jackets and boots, providing a more continuous, wind-proof seal than a row of buttons could. The U.S. military adopted zippers for aviator jackets and gear during World War I, giving the technology a stamp of rugged, masculine approval. That the real battleground, the place where the zipper would make its most audacious challenge, was on the fly of a men's trousers. And this leads to one of the most amusing marketing showdowns in fashion history, a little minus known conflict that has been dubbed the Battle of the Fly. This is our niche historical detail. For centuries, the trouser fly had been secured by a row of buttons. In the 1930s, tailors began offering the zipper as a new, modern alternative. The French fashion press, in particular, hailed the zipper as a triumph of convenience. But conservative menswear purveyors in Britain and America were horrified. They launched a counter-offensive, arguing that the zipper was vulgar and untrustworthy. They subtly implied that a zipper could fail at a most inopportune and embarrassing moment. More than that, they framed the button fly as a mark of a true gentleman, a man of quality and tradition. They argued, was not in such a hurry that he needed to zip himself up. He had the time and the composure to deal with proper buttons. The button became a symbol of tradition, of craftsmanship, and of a certain old minus world sartorial integrity. The zipper was for flashy moderns who valued speed over substance. It was a culture war fought on a few square inches of fabric. This conflict raises a fascinating question for historians of technology and culture. How do we choose which technology becomes dominant? Is it always about pure functionality? The zipper was, arguably, faster, but was it better? That depends on your definition. Button-fly proponents argued that their closure was more durable, easier to repair. You can sew a button back on, but a broken zipper is often a fatal flaw for the garment, and allowed for a smoother, flatter front on the trousers. The debate wasn't just about the technical merits. It was about the cultural meaning attached to each technology. The zipper was associated with youth, modernity, and a certain American can-do spirit. The button, in this context, was rebranded as a symbol of European tradition, heritage, and bespoke quality. The choice between a zipper and a button fly became a small way of signaling your personal values. Did you see yourself as a modern man of the future, or a classic gentleman of substance? Ultimately, of course, the zipper won a decisive victory. Its convenience was too great to ignore, and it became the standard closure on most trousers, jackets, and bags. But the button didn't disappear. It retreated, but it regrouped. It ceded the territory of pure, utilitarian fastening to the zipper, and instead doubled down on its other strengths. It remained the preferred choice for shirt fronts, for cuffs, for formal wear, and for any garment where the look of the fastener was as important as its function. The battle forced the button to find a new purpose. It couldn't compete with the zipper on speed, so it had to compete on aesthetics, on tradition, and on decorative value. The tailor's shop, with its heated debate about zippers and fries, dissolved. The focus on clothing, on the simple act of fastening fabric, begins to broaden. You've moved into the turbulent, noisy world of 20th-century public life, into the crowded streets of a political rally, the buzz of a concert hall, and the passionate chaos of a protest mob. And you, on the lapels of jackets and the front of shirts, you see the button has taken on an entirely new job. It is no longer just holding clothes together. It is broadcasting a message. This is the key development for this part of our journey, the evolution of the button into a piece of portable propaganda, a badge of identity, and a tiny, wearable billboard for your beliefs. The button has uncoupled itself from the buttonhole and found a new partner, the safety pin. It has become the pin-back button, or we commonly call a badge. The technology for this was actually developed in the late 19th century. The first patent for a version of the pin-back button as we know it, a metal disc with a design on the front, and a pin on the back, was issued in 1896. Its original purpose was mostly novelty and advertising. You might get a button with a picture of a famous actress, or one that said drink Coca minus cola, but its true potential was quickly realized in the world of politics. The first major outing for the political button was the 1896 U.S. presidential election between William McKinley and William Jennings Bryan. Suddenly, you could literally wear your allegiance on your sleeve. Supporters brandished buttons with black minus and minus white photos and candidate, or with catchy slogans like gold standard for McKinley or free silver for Bryan. It was a simple, chic, and incredibly effective way to create a sense of shared identity among supporters and to make your political preference visible to everyone you met. It transformed a person's body into a tiny walking poster. From that point on, the political button became a standard feature of every election cycle. But its use soon exploded beyond mainstream politics. You drift through the decades and see the button telling the story of social change. In the 1960s, you see a young protester at an anti-war march. His jacket is a canvas of his beliefs, adorned with buttons that read "Make love, not war, give peace a chance," and the iconic yellow smiley face, which, in a quirky detail of pop culture history, was originally designed for an insurance company, but was quickly co-opted by the counter-culture as a symbol of optimism and defiance. The smiley face button is a perfect example of how a symbol could be created for one purpose and then completely appropriated by the public to mean something else entirely. The original designer was paid a pittance and the design was never copyrighted, allowing it to become a universal, free floating icon. You see a feminist in the 1970s with a button that says sisterhood is powerful or futures, the female gender symbol. You see a punk rocker in the 1980s, his leather jacket covered in buttons for his favorite bands, the Sex Pistols, the Clash, the Ramones. The button became the currency of subculture. Wearing a button for an obscure band was a way of signaling to other fans that you were in the know. It was a secret handshake, a way of finding your tribe in a crowded world. This transformation from a functional object to a purely communicative one raises an interesting question that sociologists and cultural historians still explore. What is the power of such a small, seemingly insignificant object? A button can't vote. It can't pass a law. It can't stop a war. One theory is that its power lies in its ability to make the invisible visible. Your political beliefs, your musical tastes, your social stances, these are all internal. A button externalizes them. It makes your personal convictions public, creating a sense of solidarity and collective identity. When you're in a crowd and you see someone else wearing the same button as you, You feel an instant connection. It's a silent affirmation that you are not alone in your belief. Another perspective is that it's a form of micro-activism. It's a low-risk, low-effort way of participating in a public conversation. You might be too shy to shout at a rally or write a letter to a politician, but you can wear a button. It allows for a passive, yet constant, form of expression, and while one button might not change the world, 1,000 buttons, all worn by different people in different places, can create a powerful visual representation of a movement's scale and reach. The button has come a long way from holding a medieval doubled close. By freeing itself from the buttonhole, it found a new and arguably more powerful way to fasten things together, not pieces of cloth, but people, ideas, and movements. It became a tiny, circular stage for the dramas of public life, a way to tell the world who you are and what you stand for, one lap at a time. The roar of the protest march, the passionate chants, the sea of faces, it all recedes into a gentle hum. Then silence. The pin-back button, with its loud, public decoration, shrinks back into something smaller, quieter, and infinitely more personal. You are no longer in a crowd, but in a quiet room, bathed in the warm glow of a single desk lamp. The air is still and smells faintly of old paper and dust. In front of you is a large, flat tray, lined with velvet, and arranged in neat, obsessive rows are buttons. Not political buttons, not advertising buttons, but buttons of every conceivable age and material. A woman sits hunched over the tray, a jeweler's loupe pressed to her eye, examining a small, dark object. She is not looking for a slogan, she is looking for a story. You've entered the world of the button collector, a passionate, surprisingly organized subculture dedicated to preserving these tiny artifacts. This is the main point of this quiet corner of the modern world, button collecting, or SDI, is not just a casual hobby of saving interesting things in a jar. It is a serious, scholarly pursuit. You are witnessing a member of a global community, perhaps even a member of the National Button Society, founded back in 1938. These collectors have their own publications, their own national conventions with fierce but friendly competitions, and a shared language so specific it's almost impenetrable to outsiders. They don't just see a pretty button, they see a gay 90s picture button depicting Little Red Riding Hood, or a rare black glass button from the Victorian mourning period. The level of specialization is where you find the most fascinating niche details of this world. The woman with the loupe might be examining the back of a Civil War-era Union Army button. She isn't just identifying the eagle emblem on the front. She is studying the back mark, the tiny, stamped name of the company that manufactured it. To a collector, a button made by the Scoville Manufacturing Company might be common, while one from a smaller, short-lived maker could be a rare prize. They even have a name for this specific focus back markology. Then you look at another tray. It's filled with what look like tiny, intricate metal minus enamel scenes. These are picture buttons, one of the most coveted categories. They depict anything and everything scenes from operas, characters from fables, mythological creatures, detailed castles, and famous landmarks. A single, rare picture button showing, say, a scene from a Jules Verne novel, can be worth hundreds, even thousands, of dollars to the right collector. They are miniature canvases that tell the story of what people in the 19th century cared about. Collectors also speak of shrinkology, the study of the loop on the back of the button, as its shape and construction can be a key clue to the button's age and origin. This intense passion for such a humble object raises a question that sociologists and cultural historians find quite interesting. What exactly are these collectors doing? Are they preserving history? Or are they simply satisfying a psychological urge to accumulate and create order? One perspective is that these collectors are, in fact, crucial grassroots historians. They are rescuing and cataloging a part of our material culture that would otherwise be completely lost. Museums might save the gowns of queens and the uniforms of generals, but who saves the mass-produced vegetable ivory button from a 1922 house dress? The collectors do. They are creating a distributed, private archive of small history. Each button in their collection is a tangible data point, a primary source that speaks of past technologies, artistic trends, social customs, and economic conditions. From this viewpoint, their obsession is a noble act of preservation. But another school of thought looks at it through a more psychological lens. This view suggests that the button itself is secondary. The primary driver is the fundamental human impulse to collect, the thrill of the hunt, the satisfaction of completing a set, the comfort of creating a small, ordered, beautiful world that you can control. The historical narrative, while genuinely fascinating to the collectors, is also a sophisticated justification for this impulse. The collecting instinct comes first, and the button, with its infinite variety and rich history, just happens to be a perfect subject for it. It could have been stamps, or coins, or teacups, but the button provides a uniquely tactile and story-minus rich focus for this innate desire. You watch as the woman carefully places the black glass button into its designated spot in the tray. For her, the debate is irrelevant. For her, this small object is both a piece of history and a personal treasure. The button, having lived a life of function, of fashion, of politics, now finds its final purpose here, in the quiet, climate-controlled afterlife of the collection. It no longer needs to hold anything closed or shout a message. Its only job now is to be itself, and to be appreciated. You gently close the velvet-lined tray, the quiet clicking of the collector's buttons fading into a soft memory. The warm lamplight dissolves, and you find yourself back in the familiar, brightly lit world of today. The air hums with the low thrum of technology, the scent of coffee, and the faint, clean smell of air conditioning. You've completed the journey. You're back where you started, but now the world looks a little different. You look at the clothes on the people passing by in a busy cafe. A cyclist unzips a high-tech athletic jacket. A child kicks off a pair of sneakers. The rasp of the Velcro fastener sharp and quick. A woman snaps her handbag shut with a satisfying magnetic click. In this world of effortless, efficient closures, it seems, at first glance, that the button has finally lost the war. It has been outmaneuvered by technologies that are faster, stronger, and easier to use, especially for children or anyone with limited dexterity. The button, it seems, is a relic. But then you look closer. This is the final, quiet state of the button in our contemporary world. It has not vanished, but has instead retreated to its strongholds, the places where its unique character is still valued. A man at a nearby table is in a business meeting, wearing a well-stated suit. Running down the front of his jacket and on his cuffs are a series of simple, elegant buttons, likely made of horn or corals, though they aren't there because they are the fastest option. They are there because they are the right option. They signal tradition, quality, and a certain deliberate thoughtfulness. A zipper on a suit cuff would be a jarring, cheap-looking mistake. The button has become a signifier of classic, timeless style. It has seeded the worlds of sportswear and children's wear, but it still reigns supreme in the kingdom of formal and business attire. And even now, in our age of silicon and code, the button continues to evolve in strange and unexpected ways. This is our final quirky detail. You might find a modern, high-end jacket with smart buttons. On the outside, they look like normal buttons, but embedded within is a tiny NFC near-field communication chip. The owner can tap their smartphone to the button to bring up the brand's website, verify the garment's authenticity, or even access special care instructions. The button, after all these centuries, has found a way to connect to the internet. We also share renewed interest in sustainable materials, with buttons being made from recycled plastics, compressed paper, or even casein, a plastic-like material derived from milk protein. The button's long, slow journey from a decorative shell in the Indus Valley to a tiny computer chip in a modern jacket brings us to one final, quiet debate. What is the future of the button? Are we witnessing its final, graceful decline into a niche, ceremonial object, like the inkwell or the wax seal? A beautiful thing we appreciate for its history that no longer truly need? Or is its very persistence a sign of its fundamental, enduring appeal? Some historians of technology argue that the button's trajectory is clear. It will become increasingly rare, a conscious, stylistic choice made by designers and consumers who are deliberately rejecting modern convenience in favor of an older aesthetic. It will be the vinyl record of fasteners, warmer, more authentic, but ultimately unleash interests. Others, however, argue that the button will never disappear because it fulfills a basic human need that a zipper or a magnet cannot. This slow, rhythmic act of buttoning a shirt can be a meditative, grounding moment at the start of a day. The weight and feel of a good button connects us to a long history of craftsmanship. They argue that as our world gets faster and more virtual, we will crave these small, tactile connections to the real world even more. The button's slowness, once seen as a flaw, may become its greatest strength. You reach down and idly toy with the button on your own sleeve. A simple disc of plastic, most likely. It holds your cuff close, but it's also a direct descendant of a king's golden treasure, a soldier's last identifier, a potter's tiny canvas, and a revolutionary's quiet decoration. It has been on an impossibly long journey to get here, to this quiet moment with you. It no longer needs to shout. It is content, now, to simply be